We're following the stories of 4 women fighting for a more tolerant country tonight. Iran unveiled. Taking on the Ayatollahs is here in 45 minutes, straight after the ITV News at 10.
For year after year, we've been told by this government that balancing the books was a critical national emergency. Not anymore. The Chancellor claimed today austerity was now coming to an end. Borrowing will rise next year, so will spending. And then there was this.
A tax cut for 32 million people. £130 in the pocket of a typical basic rate taxpayer.
In short, Father Christmas has arrived early, but mostly for the NHS. It is certainly not a bonanza for the rest of our public services. We will comb through it all in detail tonight. Also on News at 10. The sun and the stars. In Leicester, the players join the owner's family in mourning. The end of an era. Germany's Angela Merkel announces she will step down as party leader, and Brazil elects a far-right president. So what will it mean for the world's 4th largest democracy?
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. We have all here lost count of the amount of times we've talked about the deficit on this programme. You probably have too. The reason, of course, because this government has insisted for the past decade that balancing the books was a critical national emergency. But not anymore, apparently. Today they seem to just abandon that idea altogether. Spending will rise, though only the NHS is likely to feel it. Taxes, or at least some of them, will fall. So what do we all really need to know? Well, the Chancellor brought forward a manifesto promise for more generous personal allowances, and he shut the door on so-called PFI. He addressed some of the hot political topics of the moment: universal credit, business rates, the tax paid by the big internet giants, social and mental health care. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, called it a budget of broken promises.
Probably the last budget before Brexit, his third and maybe his final bow, given his knack for annoying the Prime Minister and his colleagues. Today he chose to heap praise, however, on all of us, repeatedly.
As the hard work of the British people is paying off, due to the hard work of the British people, thanks to the hard work of the British people, the hard work of the British people.
So what would be our reward for all that hard work?
I can report to the British people that their hard work is paying off and the era of austerity is finally coming to an end.
Ah yes, 8 years of savage cuts in public services. Over, at last. Or at least so the Chancellor claimed, as he contrasted George Osborne's 3% a year reductions in what the government spent with...
From next year, it will be plus 1.2% average annual real growth.
And in a naked appeal to his own MPs not to derail the Prime Minister's Brexit talks, he added...
But that is not the limit of my ambition. When our EU negotiations deliver a deal, as I'm confident they will, I expect that the deal dividend will allow us to provide further funding for the spending review.
Most of the extra money comes from a new calculation of how much existing taxes will raise, and most of it will go to the health service. But there's a big welfare top-up for universal credit and one eye-catching new tax.
And it is clearly not sustainable or fair that digital platform businesses can generate substantial value in the UK without paying tax here in respect of that business.
He was referring to the likes of Google, Facebook and Amazon. And
we will now introduce a UK digital services tax.
It was a long budget speech and the jokes were, well, you judge.
I'm pleased to announce a new mandatory business rates relief for public lavatories, so that local authorities can at last relieve themselves for the convenience of the House, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and without wishing to get unduly bogged down on this subject.
There was party politics as the Tory Chancellor finally responded to Labour's pledge that it would abolish the controversial and expensive use of private money to build schools, hospitals and other public projects.
I can announce that the government will abolish the use of PFI and PF2 for future projects.
And finally, a naked tax bribe. Reductions in tax allowances which might make you think there could be an election somewhat earlier than the scheduled date of 2022.
A tax cut for 32 million people. £130 in the pocket of a typical basic rate taxpayer.
Jeremy Corbyn. Thank you.
But Labour was unimpressed.
The Prime Minister pledged austerity is over. This, Mr Deputy Speaker, is a broken promise budget. What we've heard today are half measures and quick fixes while austerity grinds on. And far from people's hard work and sacrifices having paid off, as the Chancellor claims, this government has frittered it away in ideological tax cuts to the richest in our society.
And the Shadow Chancellor told me the Labour Party would therefore vote against the budget.
No, that's why we'll be saying this isn't good enough, bring it back to the drawing board, because we want real improvement. This continues austerity on. That's unacceptable. When they promised austerity would come to an end, it certainly hasn't.
Tonight in Downing Street it was cold enough to remind us that Christmas isn't too far away. But to be clear, even if the Chancellor is Scrooge no longer, he's certainly not Santa. Robert Peston, News at 10.
So the Chancellor talked about austerity coming to an end and yet discipline remaining. How does he balance those seemingly opposing aims? Our economics editor Joel Hills is here, of course. Now, Joel, let's not bang on about how much we banged on about the deficit. I think it's time to stop testing the audience's patience on that. But listen, what's going on?
Well, look, balancing the books wasn't just some vague aspiration. It was an election manifesto promise. It was a point of difference twice between the Conservatives and the Labour Party. They were showing prudence. Labour was reckless. And ironically, before Philip Hammond stood up and delivered his budget, he was actually on course to hit his target. According to the OBR, he was going to eliminate borrowing by 2023, thanks to stronger tax receipts and slightly faster economic growth forecasts. But the Chancellor effectively decided to take all of that windfall from borrowing and spend it on ending austerity instead of raising taxes. So by 2023, the OBR, as you can see there, now thinks that he'll be borrowing £20 billion by 2023. And he's on course, in effect, to miss his fiscal objective.
OK, well, you mentioned there he's, quotes, ending austerity or austerity's coming to an end. Is he?
Well, it's certainly easing. I think the key figure that he promoted was that spending on public services will rise by 1.2% in real terms, adjusting for inflation, adjusting for population growth, and that is true. But the NHS will hoover up most of the benefit. Have a look at this chart here. This is really interesting. The lion's share goes to the NHS, while NHS spending accelerates away in real terms over the next 5 years. Look what happens to spending for other government's departments. They remain completely flat. Unprotected departments, Tom, are likely to be worse off. Local authorities, councils should be worried. And if anyone would also note that universal credit has been made more generous by the Chancellor, but welfare cuts announced by George Osborne in 2015, £5 billion of those still roll on. They haven't been changed. And there's a rather controversial tax cut as well. Tonight, Labour are just warming up to the fact that moving the income tax thresholds disproportionately benefits the wealthiest households in UK. It's high tax owners, high earners who will derive the biggest benefit from that. Now, the Chancellor will argue he was just delivering on another manifesto pledge. He didn't have to bring it forward, though, and this is going to cause outrage.
OK. Joel, thank you very much indeed. Let's just take a quick look now at some of the other main budget announcements. The Chancellor said duties will again be frozen on fuel and on beer, cider and spirits too. That should ease the run-up to Christmas. Not such good news for wine drinkers, though, I'm afraid. The duty on that is going up by RPI, otherwise known as inflation, and the cost of cigarettes will rise as well. The national living wage is set to increase by nearly 5% to £8.21 per hour. There will be more money for schools, an extra £400 million, which Philip Hammond said would go towards the little extras. That works out, if you're wondering, to save you the mass, on average £10,000 per primary school and £50,000 per secondary school. There is an extra £1 billion for defence, with particular focus on boosting cyber warfare capabilities. A further £160 million for counter-terrorism policing, and tax bills could increase for big tech giants like Google and Facebook, who face a new digital services tax. A big argument today about how much that is going to raise, but that's for another time. Now, the Chancellor kicked off his speech saying it was a budget for people who get up early in the morning to open up factories, drop their children off at school, care for elderly relatives, and who live their lives far from Westminster. So we went nearly 200 miles from there to Hull, in fact, to find out what those hard-working families made of it.
A Britain open for business was the Chancellor's budget message, and Hull physically embodies that. But he promised a people's budget, and here the people aren't sure whether they got it. This is the DeLuca family, helped by the new £12,500 personal tax allowance. With 2 cars, the fuel duty freeze helps, and Mum Claire works in primary schools now, each getting a £10,000 bonus.
I think it's good news in one sense that they have acknowledged that schools need money, primary schools in particular. But on the other hand, £10,000, is it going to even touch the sides? You know, and it's not ring-fenced for any certain project.
But Italian-born Leandro De Luca feels brighter. A pre-Brexit boost to family finances is what he wanted, and for this household, the new tax threshold delivered.
And the fact that high tax income rate is definitely better and came even before than expected. So that will definitely put in average family a bit more money in their pocket, so we can spend a bit more at the same time, and is good for hard-working people.
Osara Otobo is unsure whether a new £500 million fund will help her onto the housing ladder. She questions whether the new £37 million transport investment for the North is enough, and she appreciates the new 26 to 30 rail card, but says more should be done for the young.
I do feel like young people feel like they don't have it as good as their parents and grandparents, and it's so frustrating. And we do try to work hard, but when there's not enough support from the government behind that, that just makes things even harder.
As a retailer, Andrew Taylor benefits from a 1/3 cut in his business rate. He welcomes the new digital services tax on internet giants and has concerns over a new tax on plastic packaging.
The sugar tax is still relatively new, and to follow that up now with the plastic tax, it's just something else for the industry. Who's going to judge what plastic's taxed? And you know, if you look around the shop, there's plastic everywhere, and plastic packaging is a massive part of the industry. So it's going to be really interesting to find out what gets taxed and what gets left alone.
As a launchpad towards Brexit and the end of austerity, this budget had a big job. Here, the debate over whether it turned out to be more trick than treat is tonight underway. Chris Choi, News at 10 in Hull.
And if that's the view from Hull, let's get the view from Robert here in the studio, of course. I've got to say, this felt like a budget that was very much predicated on the idea we're going to get a Brexit deal soon.
So I think the Chancellor was essentially trying to put considerable fear into his wavering backbench colleagues, those who are not sure whether when the time comes they should back any deal that the Prime Minister may negotiate, that if they block a deal and we head for a no-deal Brexit, well, then they're going to have a lot of explaining to do to their constituents. I mean, what he was saying is, so long as the OBR's assumption that we get a deal is proved correct, then it is the end of austerity. There will be more money going into health, but also into other public services. And he's saying to them, well, all bets are off if there's a no-deal Brexit, and you're going to have to explain to your constituents why public services aren't improving if, you know, you essentially... Yeah.
OK, a cynic might say most chancellors would be happy with kind of reasonable spending increases. He's thrown in some tax cuts as well. That kind of feels like something you might do if you thought you were about to walk into an election.
Well, that was certainly my feeling as soon as I saw that, you know, these tax cuts that, you know, had been rumoured for the past couple of days, but when they became a reality, I just thought this is extraordinary because, in theory, the next election is not till 2022. There's nothing to gain at the moment for a Conservative Party, which, after all, is still ahead in the polls, from putting bribes to the electorate now, unless the Prime Minister does think that there is a significant risk that the Brexit will be rejected by Parliament. We are then into votes of no confidence and a possible general election. This looks like insurance against the prospect, the possibility of an early general election.
OK, we will see. Robert, for now, thank you very much indeed. Well, still to come on tonight's News at 10, the wheelchair that Professor Stephen Hawking used to whiz around Cambridge in is looking for a new home. We will be back in half a minute, literally.
Charlie, she's just my favourite.
Hen Power brings together older people and involves them in creativity and hen keeping.
They're so therapeutic. They've filled that empty space.
TSB gave us funding to set up projects across the country.
I've made friends from 4-year-old to 94. It's the best thing that ever happened.
People helping people is a good thing for all of us. That's why TSB supports local causes like ours and Partners Pride of Britain.
Welcome back, and a very different kind of story now. For the past 8 years, the two families of the Leicester City chairman, his real one and his adopted one at the football club he did so much to support, have shared some of the greatest highs the sport can offer. Today, it was grief that brought them together. Players like Jamie Vardy and Kasper Schmeichel stood alongside his son in reflection beside the field of flowers left by fans. Prince William added his voice to the tributes.
It is his death they are marking, but his life they are honouring. There is a collective grief here for Vishai Shirad Hanaprabha, but the true grief belongs to those who best knew and loved the man himself. Surrounded by the team he helped build, Vishai's wife and son sought what solace they could from his footballing family. Picking up a single stem which had fallen from the wreath, Imon Vishai paused for a moment at the centre circle, where the helicopter took off from. What a very lonely walk across the ground her husband had taken his final steps on. Earlier, they had seen the tributes brought by those who credit Vishai with bringing to life the dreams of this club and its fans. Fans who are now left bereft at his loss.
Gets to the heart of people.
Very sad. It's complete and utter devastation. He breathed so much life into Leicester City, but not just as a football team, as a city.
Despite their grief, the players joined with fans alongside top Vishai's son and probable heir. Goalkeeper Kasper Schmeichel and striker Jamie Vardy seeking to hold their team together in a way they have never needed to before. And this is the man so many mourn, fated in life as in death for the contribution he made to Leicester, a benefactor who touched so many lives.
I promise to do all my best for our Leicester.
So many people have individual tales of that best. The Giles family, who got to meet Vishai after he heard their son had been in a motorbike crash in Thailand and paid for their accommodation whilst he was hospitalised.
This is a really nice guy who's really going to be held in our hearts for forever, really.
Killed alongside Vishai were staff members Nusara Suknami and Kavapun Punpare, along with pilot Eric Swaffer and his partner Isabella Rosa Lehovic. That no one else was killed on the ground is the only relief for those who saw the crash.
Little sparks came out the back, and then flames, and then bigger flames, and then it just exploded.
Tonight, amidst the grief, there are the questions, and the Air Accident Investigation Board has spent the day working through the debris and trying to retrieve the information from the damaged onboard data recorder, trying to establish just how this tragedy could have happened. Emma Murphy, News at 10, Leicester.
The lessons of political history, of British political history anyway, suggest that once a party leader announces he or she is stepping down, the vultures start circling and the infighting begins. Still, that doesn't seem to have stopped Germany's Angela Merkel from A, setting a departure date in 2021, if you can believe it, and B, standing down, not as Chancellor, but as party leader this December. So why this and why now? Well, her party has taken a bit of a pounding in the regional elections. She says the government has lost credibility.
For so long, one of Europe's most powerful leaders, Angela Merkel is now a political liability, and she knows it.
Und Hingabe, Versuche auszufüllen.
Announcing today she's standing down as leader of the party she's led for 18 years, but vowing to remain Germany's Chancellor.
Aber ich versuche mit dieser Entscheidung einen Beitrag zu leisten.
This decision will allow the government to get on with its job, she said. In other words, admitting that a reversal in her own party's fortunes has become a damaging distraction. Despite leading from the front, the centre-right CDU lost around a third of its support in regional elections at the weekend. For Germany, it's the beginning of the end of an era.
It's clear that her political lifetime is coming to an end, but that's been clear for a while now. The pressure has been on since the elections in September of 17, and there were a couple of kind of landmark moments between September and now where it became clear that, you know, the old forcefulness was no longer there.
And she was an unstoppable force. Raised in East Germany, she built a career in politics after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Her potential first spotted by the then German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. Becoming Germany's leader 13 years ago, her solid leadership led to a period of national stability, earning her the affectionate nickname Mutti or Mummy. Her status grew until she became the de facto leader of Europe, perhaps the most powerful figure within the European Union. French President Emmanuel Macron today paid tribute to her, saying she'd never forgotten the values of Europe. But it was her decision to open Germany's borders to refugees in 2015 that began to cause domestic damage to her reputation. Angela Merkel has vowed to stay on as Chancellor until the next national elections in 2021. That would see her continuing to have an important influence on Brexit negotiations. But her future now depends on who replaces her as party leader, an ally or a rival. After almost 2 decades at the top of German politics, her position has never been so precarious. Angus Walker, News at 10, Berlin.
Well, to Asia now, and all hope has unfortunately gone of anyone surviving a plane crash off the coast of Indonesia. The internal flight from Jakarta came down in the Java Sea 13 minutes after taking off. There were 189 passengers and crew on board, and human remains have been recovered. Families waited in vain for news. The pilot had made a return to base request just 2 minutes into the flight, and the airline, Lion Air, said there had been some kind of technical problem on its previous flight. Now, speaking of tragedies, visiting the scene of one is one of the duties of an American president. But the impending arrival of Donald Trump tomorrow in Pittsburgh, scene of a mass shooting at a synagogue on Saturday, of course, is proving highly controversial. Let's join our Washington correspondent, Robert Moore. Now, Robert, what kind of reception do you think the president can expect?
Well, I think his role tomorrow in Pittsburgh is pretty complicated. Some, of course, will welcome him because of their respect for the office of the presidency. But his liberal critics, and there are many in the Pittsburgh Jewish community, will point out that Trump's inflammatory language, his overt identification as a nationalist, the ambivalence he showed at the far-right violence in Charlottesville last year, all may have contributed to the kind of rise in the white supremacist movement, may even, in their view, have somewhat contributed to the attacks last week. And remember, last week we saw 3 separate attacks linked to white supremacists. We saw the massacre of course, in the synagogue just outside of Pittsburgh. We saw the postal bombs mailed out of Florida, and we saw some shootings in Kentucky as well. And despite all of that, the president hasn't made any meaningful calls for unity. In fact, even today, once more, he called the media the enemy of the people. So we're in this pretty surreal, uncomfortable space in America in which the president of the United States is really something of a provocateur in chief. And that's what makes next week's midterm elections so interesting. Will American voters endorse or will they reject the president's approach?
OK, Robert, thank you very much indeed. Well, to South America now, and Brazil may be one of the world's fastest growing democracies, but it also struggles with great poverty and a very high crime rate. It is an uneasy, divided society, and parallels have inevitably been drawn, therefore, between the populace, who has just been elected leader, and the American President Donald Trump. Jair Bolsonaro, a former paratrooper, did pledge today to unite the country, but that has done little to settle his opponent's nerves.
There's a new boss in the land of the bossa nova, though this one moves to an altogether less gentle rhythm.
The economy went down. We lost, a lot of work, jobs, and now it's the time to change. This guy is an honest guy.
Jair Bolsonaro took a call of congratulations from Donald Trump and promised to make Brazil great again, with this Bible as his guide. Crime, corruption and communism, the three perceived evils his supporters want the former army captain to purge.
Given Bolsonaro's nostalgia for military rule and the years of torture and killing, those comparisons with Donald Trump are probably unflattering on Trump. But there is unmistakably here more than a faint echo of America's cultural wars.
While Trump turns to Fox News, Bolsonaro has cheerleaders in the evangelical media networks, TV stations and talk radio.
Olá, boa tarde, meu Rio!
Whose Christian owners speak the same tough language on abortion, gay rights and so-called family values.
O Bolsonaro.
He represents Christian thinking, Luceni Alves, a Rio radio host, tells me. He's against the equality of the sexes and paedophiles. Yet in this city's slums, it's not a cultural war, but a shooting war that beckons. The new president has promised to step up the armed assault on drug gangs. But at what price? These bullet holes are the only monument to a short life. Adriano shows me where his sister was gunned down in crossfire in one of many battles between police and a local gang. She was 21 years old and the mother of 2 children.
I don't believe that sending weapons against weapons will solve the problem of violence. It will just mean a bloodbath.
Bolsonaro fits the old mold of strongman leaders from Brazil and beyond, suddenly in step with troubled times. John Ray, News at 10, Rio de Janeiro.
And finally, from the estate of the late, great Professor Stephen Hawking, author of A Brief History of Time, a unique archive of our time is going up for sale. The professor's family is auctioning some of his manuscripts, his mementos, and the famous wheelchair in which he used to race around Cambridge.
We used to sort of have rides on it, stand on the edge, try and drive it.
For Lucy Hawking growing up, her father's wheelchair was a source of endless fun.
He went at great speed in this wheelchair. So many people have memories of him bombing through Cambridge at top speed, sort of swerving round corners.
But it soon became a symbol of his steely defiance of the odds.
My illness has meant that I cannot use pencil and paper. I'm impatient with waste of time. There is so much I want to do.
And he did. A chair from which Professor Stephen Hawking conquered the universe. It is part of a collection of his most prized possessions that are now being sold at auction, which include a copy of his bestseller, A Brief History of Time, signed with a thumbprint as he was no longer able to write. One of only 5 existing copies of his doctoral thesis on the origins of the universe. And this script from his 2009 appearance on the TV show The Simpsons.
Your theory of a donut-shaped universe is intriguing, Homer.
With this sale, his children hope to preserve his scientific archive for the nation.
The real wrench for me is seeing these items together and realising that my father is not there. That's the saddest thing for me.
Her father's legacy, though, will live on through his scientific discoveries and through his charities, which will benefit from the proceeds of this sale. Sejal Karia, News at 10.
Well, that's almost it, but let's just take a very quick look at what tomorrow's newspapers might be making of the budget. The Independent says the Chancellor's extra spending on the NHS and universal credit could be scuppered if there's a no-deal Brexit, rather, as Robert was saying earlier. The Telegraph claims taxpayers have been given a Brexit bonus. The paper says it was one of the biggest giveaway budgets in recent history. And The Guardian says the tax cuts are aimed at shoring up Mrs May's government and improving the morale of what it calls fractious Conservative MPs. Fractious, you think? That's it from me for tonight. I'll be here tomorrow. For now, good night. Thank you very much for watching.